Good afternoon. My name is Bryce Spencer-Jones, and I'm the host of the Unstuck Yourself podcast and also the moderator of today's discussion on men's mental health. Before I do get started, I want to emphasize and leave a disclaimer that some of the topics we might touch on today might be a little bit heavier. So if by any chance you feel like you are uncomfortable or you need to take a step back, we recommend that you step away from the conversation and return at your own pace. So there is a popular quote that says that men receive the first flowers at their funeral, and I think that honestly says a lot. 1 in 10 men will experience anxiety and depression, and less than half of them will receive treatment for it. So many men just want to be seen and heard, and they have so many emotions that they're holding on to, but they might not be comfortable reaching out due to societal expectations, or they might not have the resources to even know where to start their healing. So I am beyond excited to have this conversation today because we have some amazing panelists, including Kevin Simon, who is Boston's first Chief Behavioral Health Officer, and we have Kalen Jackson, who is the Vice Chairman and owner of the Indianapolis Colts, and she also launched the Kicking the Stigma campaign, which is responsible for funding different mental health projects in the Indianapolis area. We also have Pierre. He is the staff psychologist at Brandeis University, and he's also the co-founder of the Ashmont Counseling Associates. So first off, thank you guys for being here and being a part of this important conversation on men's mental health. I'm going to get us started with the first question, which is, what is the biggest obstacle that you think men face when it comes to receiving mental health care? And I'll start with Kevin right here.
Yeah, so one, thank you for having me and acknowledging that you can have difficult conversations because owner of the Colts and we're in the New England area.
I know, how brave of me.
So just to start with that. But I think what you're bringing up is a very good point in terms of not enough individuals, particularly men, seek services or seek care when they're going through things. And I think you kind of touched on it even from an early standpoint. I have a 2-year-old boy, and oftentimes when boys show emotion very early on, they're kind of trained societally to kind of try to taper it down and not really fully acknowledge what the feelings are that you're actually having. And so yes, it's very easy to say like I'm mad or I'm angry, but all of the other subtle nuances of emotions, like I'm feeling emasculated or I'm feeling nervous, those tend not to be things that are emphasized on the male spectrum of emotion. So I think as we get older and we're feeling things undoubtedly, like if my wife puts out the trash and she doesn't tell me, I get a little frustrated when I get home, like, oh, why didn't you do that? But I can say, because I have some training, that, oh, I was feeling a little bit annoyed because I anticipated just laying on the couch when I got home, not doing an extra step. So I think men tend not to seek services because they're just not even fully aware of the emotion that they're having and not really knowing what avenue or where to go. And then oftentimes in the mental health field, the providers don't look like myself or Dr. Pierre. And so that also is bringing up a challenging disposition of I got to talk to someone that maybe doesn't look like me or identify as I do. So I say that those are some of the reasons that men tend not to seek services.
Yeah, I think one of the things you just touched on where men just basically don't know what they don't know. And one of the things that they talk about when it comes to mastering anything is the 4 steps is you don't know what you don't know. You're bad, you know about it, but you're bad at it. You're good at it only if you practice, and then you're good at it just naturally because you did so much on it. And so many men, they're stuck in the first stage where they don't know what they don't know. So I think that's amazing what you just said, and the fact that you are able to be aware about that. So my second question is, Kalen, I know you have a lot of experience with the Colts and the Kicking the Stigma campaign. So what is the importance behind having that representation, whether it be from mental health professionals or positive role models or the Indianapolis Colts and big organizations like that?
Well, for those who don't know about the Kicking the Stigma campaign, it is really to raise awareness and also raise funding for resources around mental health in the state of Indiana, but really also beyond. You know, we hope to be a representation of what best practices could be for other teams, but also other sport organizations or even just brands who have the power to shine a light on something that may have been not something someone would read about. For example, if someone's going to write an article about what we're doing, someone might read it because it's the Colts, and they would have not read something if it was just about behavioral health. So really realizing that power that we have and using it for a good reason. But a big part of what we're doing are our PSAs that we've done for the last 3 years. We will have one launching this fall. And those are to bring awareness, and it's not really asking for anything. It's not asking for funding in those. It's simply to be okay with this being something we talk about. And what's highlighted in them, obviously, if you've not seen one, is mainly our players, who are men, and mostly black men. And I think that we talked about this last night at a dinner we had about mental health. There is not a bigger representation of masculinity in America than football. And so to be able to break that, typical masculine thought process culturally, like you're talking about, because I agree, I think it's something from a young age that men are taught to not be okay with their feelings. To be able to, break that down with them sharing how they're feeling, sharing their emotions and talking about issues they've had, not just talking about that, but saying the words, I had depression, I went to therapy, and it being on a national campaign that's on, anywhere from CNN, Fox News, sports, anything, and just having that be entered into the conversation has really changed a lot of people's views and has definitely made people look up. We've had players that have been in the PSAs, people have come up to them and said, because I saw you talking about it, I told my dad that I needed help. Because I saw you talking about it, I genuinely was going to end my life that night, and I didn't. And so to know that there's a million of those conversations probably going on that we'll never hear about really inspires us to keep going. We're headed into over 3 years of doing it, and we're not stopping anytime soon. And just realizing the impact that we can have has really been inspirational for us.
I know that you, what you were mentioning, there's a lot of power in just that validation. And I've seen that, and I think everybody that's a creator can say that there's so much power in just like sharing your story and connecting with other people. But I know that you were nice enough to provide us with some of those PSAs you just mentioned. So we're gonna take a look at our first PSA, which is from linebacker, I believe, Darius Leonard.
Yeah, Shaq.
So let's run the clip on that one.
I feel like, just from growing up, sometimes, you're taught to, just keep things to yourself. You don't really know too much about, where to go. You say, okay, you go to your mom or your dad or your siblings, but after that, you really don't know who to turn to. You don't really know who you can trust. I struggled for a long time, and then I had to go to counseling and just realize that, there's some people out there who do this for a professional and will give you the right advice, and you just got to be able to willing to listen, learn, and willing to talk to these people. People are saying that, if I say it, nobody will ever understand it. People will look at me differently, and for me, that I'm gonna let people know that you got to speak out, because just having it on your heart all the time, that brings so much more stress on the body. You got to be able to just relieve it. You cannot just hold things in. You got to be able to talk about things and figure it out, because just because you're going through something, there's somebody that's probably going through the same exact thing and then want to hear your words. And you can't be afraid to step up. You can't be afraid to speak out, because there's so many people in this world that's living through so much pain and anxiety and mental health, and they're just looking for someone to have the same feelings. And for someone to speak out, it's something big.
I think that when it comes to men actually sharing their stories, it's so important understanding that it is okay to reach out if you're not okay. And I think it's also important for societies to have these safe spaces where men can feel comfortable enough to reach out and be vulnerable. So in what way can we actually create these safe spaces for men where they feel vulnerable? And I'll ask Martin at the end over there.
So connection allows men to recognize their own humanity. When spaces are created, whether it's by design or even intentional, it allows men to show up with their authentic selves, where they are not afraid of being put down. There's a sense of psychological safety that exists in safe spaces. And so men could show up with their multiple and intersecting identities. Safe places allow men to bear witness to each other's pain as a way of debriefing and affirming and allowing them to be vulnerable with each other. And so within these safe spaces, men give themselves a permission to talk about things that they wouldn't even tell God. And so these safe spaces could be created in churches, it could be created in synagogue, it could created in schools, because when you reveal, you heal. And so it's important for men to have these safe spaces where they could connect. One of the things that I find interesting is that in these safe spaces, men talk about ways in which they are similar versus ways which they are different. And so even though they make up 13% of the US population, 40% are represented in prison, due to the legacy of historical racism and being followed and being surveyed, they know what it means to be victims of historical stereotype. So that in itself is the context in where men of color in particularly could bear witness to each other's pain and validate each other's experience. And so they could show up without feeling judged, but feeling included.
I know there's so much power in just finding community too, and not just self-isolating. And I know a lot of men that I know, they have a habit of just kind of retreating back. But I think what you mentioned, there's a lot of power in finding these safe spaces where men can feel included and all these other things. But I know that we have another video from Kalen in the Kicking the Stigma campaign, and this one is from former head coach Tony Dungy. So let's run the clip on that one.
People sometimes don't want to talk about mental health. They don't want to talk about problems that they might have that aren't physical. But those problems are just as real. I think it's been great to see some of our sports figures, some of our football players talk about the challenges they've had. I think that's allowed people to say, gosh, if they can talk about it, so can I, and it's okay. And if they can go get help, so can I, and it's okay. I think that's a great start. I think I really did a good job of telling the players, my door is always open. Come in and see me about anything. Come in and see any of our coaches about anything. We want you to be the best that you can be on the field and off the field. You can be as tough as anyone physically, and you can be able to play with a broken leg or a broken arm and go out there. Everybody's going to marvel at that. But you know what? Mental injuries are just as debilitating. For our players to say, hey, you know what? I could tough this out physically and I could play, but I couldn't really function with this. And that lets people know that there's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, I need help and I need to get this fixed and I can't really function without it. I wish people understood that mental injuries are just as significant and just the same as physical injuries. We come off the field after practice and someone has a sprained ankle. We don't say, oh, well, we won't talk about it. I hope it gets better. No, we go right into the trainer. We get the treatment. We do whatever it takes to heal that injury. Mental illness is the same thing. We need to do the same thing and get it treated and get to the professionals and say, you know what? I've got to be as strong mentally as I am physically.
There is honestly such, there's a lot of resources like somatic therapy where it talks about that mind-body link, and I think that a lot of men, they experience some type of hardship and they immediately go in the gym, and I think they focus on their physical health, which I think is a good thing. And I also think that there should be a lot of focus on the actual mental and emotional aspects too. So in a society where men, they focus so much on physical health, how can we promote and challenge the stigmas behind vulnerability being a weakness and emotions being a weakness? And I'll ask anybody that is willing to answer that one.
I can go.
Okay.
Well, I think just in general, Martin touched on it a little bit, and I think it's so important to talk about the permission to feel a certain way, and how it sounds like such a simple thing, but it's really not. And how sometimes creating that safe space and that permission takes more than just one time. You know, and I was we were talking right before we started, and you know, we have a player who we knew had in the past struggled with depression, anxiety. He had kind of mentioned it in an article maybe, but not really. And anytime we'd interview him, he just couldn't say it. Like, he couldn't say those words. And just this past year, so 3 years in now, we're interviewing him again for this type of stuff. And he said, I struggled with depression and I went to therapy. And afterward, I was kind of hiding behind a pillar while he was filming, and I came out and was like, I am so, like, that is unbelievable. Like, it's been it's amazing to see how it took that long. And sometimes that's why it's like such a unique experience for every single person. No one mental health journey is the same. And I think trying to create a safe place so that they can show up in whatever way that is so important. And so, you know, I could go on and on. We've had a million little moments like that with our team, and you know, we hope to continue that. And we've created that space by talking about it from the top down. You know, I've struggled with anxiety my whole life. My dad has very publicly struggled with substance use disorder, and I think for them to see us saying, you know, us too, like, it's okay. It doesn't make you weak, and in fact, it can be a superpower if you let it. And so I think just creating that permission for people, I think, is just so big, especially with men.
And I think the more you talk about it too, the more easier it gets to talk about it. So if anybody wants to,
I think it's important to redefine our definition of masculinity, and that is how men show up, assuming responsibilities for our action. The idea that men has a desire to be close to other men, psychologically close, emotionally close, but we just don't know how to. And so by teaching men and being role models and giving examples of how to show up, and seeing vulnerability as a true sense of manhood and a source of strength, because within the context of vulnerability, it creates this transaction that allows people to help. You know, when you are vulnerable, it creates the context for meaningful dialogue and connection. But if you are stoic, then there is, it decreases the propensity of people to really have these open conversations. So vulnerability should be seen as a source of strength that allow people to connect on a level of lived and shared experiences.
You know, what's interesting is, as Martin's mentioning, vulnerability and creating spaces. It's why in sports, oftentimes when our athletes retire, they say they miss, or they're going to miss the locker room. Not specifically the field or the court or the track. It's that relational aspect. And what's therapy? Going someplace maybe weekly or bi-weekly. Well, what's practice? I got to go weekly, bi-weekly. And so oftentimes when I'm talking with students or those who are potentially interested in mental health but don't know how to pursue it, I'm like, you actually have a model of what it might look like. It might look like you don't want to go to practice every week, but you go and you realize going actually, oh, you know what, this was a better practice than I anticipated. Just like therapy, I go every Tuesday, 6 o'clock. Sometimes I'm like, oh, dang, Tuesday, 6 o'clock. But usually after, I feel actually rather good about the experience. So just to highlight that, it's that locker room, that relation that people do want, and men particularly want, and they can have that in a therapeutic space.
That community.
Yes.
Basically. I know we have one more video, and this one is from the Today Show, where Carson Daly, I don't think he's in here yet, but he'll be the next event. He's talking with rapper Logic, who is very open about his mental health and his experience with anxiety. So let's watch that one.
I remember it was about 5 years ago when I had this crazy panic attack and I didn't even really understand what was going on.
I had one, bro.
Yeah.
The breakthrough.
Yeah, it was like a huge one. And I'd had panic attacks or whatever. This was different because then it changed how I viewed reality. And I went through this thing called derealization, where you feel like you're kind of out of it.
I speak your language. Go ahead.
My buddy, Chris Zaru, who's actually my manager, he was like, man, you got anxiety. And I was like, no, I don't. He's like, you have anxiety, bro. And I was like, no, I don't. Like, because I didn't want to be, I don't know, like labeled as this person with anxiety. My mom had anxiety. It was this whole thing. But I say all that to say I'd always been able to write. But now as a father and a husband and someone who is still very much a part of the scene, Twitch, playing video games and streaming with people and all this stuff, it can be a lot. But I see a therapist. I see a therapist once a week. She's the bomb. And it allows me to get these thoughts out. But even before her, I was always still speaking to loved ones and people that I felt close with, even if it was difficult and scary to initiate. I still did that. So I think that is something that's really important.
Right. And you're right. Like the simple fact of like talking about it on any level. I mean, I had the same experience where I was like, I don't have anxiety. What's anxiety? That's a word that like my father would say, anxiety is not a real diagnosis of anything. Yeah. It means you're lazy. So that's something my dad would say.
Yeah.
And come to find out that's not the case. And simply just talking about it. If you have a 10-minute conversation with someone, saying, I don't know what I'm thinking. I'm feeling kind of weird, feeling a little nervous. I get this kind of fight or flight. I get real scared. I start to get out of my body a little bit. All those triggers, you could talk to somebody about it. You'll feel better like that. Like that's already one way to bring anxiety levels down.
Yeah, it's so important just getting those things out, whether it be writing or painting, whatever it might be. I know that my dad is engaged and I call his fiance my second mom, basically. And I remember her telling me, she's Puerto Rican, and she was telling me that a lot of the men in her life, she described them as very machismo. And basically having a hard time just like being vulnerable and all these other things. So I was going to ask the panel, is there any types of groups that have a harder time receiving mental health care, whether it be from age, race, whether it be any other factors?
Well, I mean, we've already kind of, we've definitely talked about,
Yeah.
I mean, Martin, you can speak mostly to it. I always say, like, I'm not the expert up here, but I know, just to speak a little bit about, so we have a Kalen Stigma fund that gives money to grants for amazing organizations, and one of them specifically that we had talked about before is one that really focuses on culturally driven treatment and how a lot of people aren't doing that yet. Right. And that's something that really, really matters. We talked about code switching and what that would be like if you're coming to the it's already hard enough to ask for help. So you do that first. Then you have to find someone, which is also another hurdle. Then you get to that person and they don't understand you. You feel like you have to talk a certain way for them to even accept what you're talking about. And imagine that feeling and how, definitely the BIPOC population, especially Black men, I know, and I'll hand it off to you to talk kind of more specifically about the details of that.
Yeah. And so culturally responsive intervention is when therapists are intentional and consistent in appreciating the unique characteristics in a person. It means that they are constantly interrogating themselves so that they are aware of the attitude, the knowledge, the skills that they have in order to provide culturally responsive treatment. It means decolonizing mental health and situating culture as the nexus. It means using culturally competent intervention, bringing in indigenous healing, challenging diagnosis that's based on Western norms, and appreciating that the person is embedded in a socio-political, geopolitical, systemic environment. And we can't treat the person devoid of what is happening socially, politically. And so the political is psychological and personal. And so understanding that systems of racism and oppression and everyday racism is embedded, and acknowledging that, and allowing the person to have the permission to bring that within the therapeutic relationship process.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's a lot of intergenerational effects from it. And I know I say it all the time in my community that we were raised by fathers that were in war, where they didn't necessarily need emotion, and then that eventually got passed on to us. And it's basically our job to kind of recognize these patterns and then work on making sure we don't pass it down to our sons and all of that. So we have time for one more question. I'm gonna ask it, and then everybody can answer it in a few sentences. But the question is, what does a society look like where men's mental health is fully supported? And then we'll start with Kevin.
Yeah, so a society like that would be one where it's okay for boys in school to kind of have their outbursts if they want to have an outburst, and have a space where they can kind of actually talk about what that is, not just be put in suspension or detention. Same thing with adolescents and adults, enabling groups and spaces for men to show up as they actually are, and not have to code switch, and not have to be something other than like who they truly want to be. So I think that that's what a society would look like, and there are pockets of areas and some campaigns that are happening that are trying to move us in that direction. So I'm rather hopeful with regards to the fact that we even have this type of conversation. Is something that I'm not sure I've seen before in my time of training as a psychiatrist.
Yeah, for my own personal question, I know you mentioned schooling. Do you think that adding emotional literacy classes would help challenge these different perceptions?
Yes, and we have evidence of this. Like, there are places in school districts that have social emotional learning, have yoga, where kids are intentionally like put within the curricula, and the outcomes of those who have those kind of curricula in their school district versus those that don't. Those that do actually do well, better academically, do well from a stress standpoint. So I would say that yes, we should have it. We're actually looking at that in Boston ourselves. So yes, I would commend that.
I love that. So we'll go with Kalen next on what do you think that a society looks like where men's mental health is fully supported?
Well, I immediately thought of two things: a much happier society, and also one where we probably wouldn't be sitting here right now, where that conversation is just part of the culture we live in. I think we talk a lot about in the work that we do how this is a cultural issue. This is something that's embedded into how we view people, and how we view mental health and behavioral health, and how medical issues are over here and behavioral health over here, and until they're brought into the same conversation and looked at the same, I feel like is a big component of a lot of this kind of not becoming something that we're constantly focusing on in terms of the things that we're missing, because this is something that's missing. And I think, again, I go back to the permission thing. I think when those permissions, those safe places are built in to all parts of society, schools, businesses. We talk a lot about what we offer our employees. Are we doing enough for our staff? And what are the responsibilities of corporations in this type of conversation? So I think until it's embedded into society, that's what it'll look like when it's embedded.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
I think it means we continually engage in self-interrogation and being aware of our own implicit bias and stereotypes that we have regarding men in general and black males in particular. It means challenging hegemonic notions of masculinity. It means creating spaces and providing opportunities for men to come together in community in order for us to validate and affirm each other, and giving us permission to become vulnerable in the presence of each other.
Yeah, so unfortunately, that is all the time we have today for this discussion on men's mental health. thank you for everybody that's in here and everybody that is watching live. So if you missed any part of it, you came into the live stream late, or you want to rewatch it at a later time, it will be on the Harvard Chan website and also on the YouTube channel as well. So other than that, my name is Bryce Spencer-Jones, and thank you for being a part of this discussion.